The council chambers had never felt so empty before. Ambassador Helen Price walked through the long corridor one final time, her footsteps echoing against the crystal walls that had witnessed 2 centuries of human participation in galactic affairs. She carried a single datapad in her hand, containing humanity's formal withdrawal from the Galactic Council. The document was short, barely 3 pages long, and it said everything that needed to be said without anger or accusations. Helen had spent weeks crafting those words with her team, making sure every sentence was clear and respectful. They cited irreconcilable differences in fundamental values and thanked the Council for the centuries of cooperation. There were no threats hidden in the text, no promises of revenge, no dramatic declarations of independence. It was simply a resignation letter, the kind any professional might write when leaving a job that no longer aligned with their principles. 3 days had passed since Helen submitted that document, and now she was leaving the Council headquarters for the last time. The Vrexian guards at the entrance nodded to her as she passed. She had shared coffee with them countless mornings, learned about their families, celebrated their promotions. One of them, a young officer named Krell, looked like he wanted to say something but remained silent. Helen gave him a small smile and continued walking toward the transport station where her shuttle waited. Across the galaxy, Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the transport vessel Mercy, watching his fleet assemble in orbit above the human colony of New Vancouver. 300 ships of various sizes floated in formation, their hulls gleaming under the light of the local star. Jake had been given command of the entire civilian evacuation fleet, a responsibility that weighed heavily on his shoulders. 5 million humans needed to be transported from Council space back to the Sol system, and every single one of them was his responsibility. He checked the manifest again, reviewing the pickup schedule for the 12th time that morning. New Vancouver was just the first stop. After this, they would move to Brighton Colony, then to the research stations on Kepler 7, then to the mining outposts on the frontier rim. Down on the surface of New Vancouver, families were packing their belongings into storage containers. Children asked their parents why they had to leave their friends behind. The adults gave answers that ranged from honest to evasive, depending on how much they thought their kids could understand. Nobody seemed angry, which surprised the non-human residents who watched the exodus with confused expressions. There were no protests, no riots, no destruction of property. Humans simply closed their businesses, said goodbye to their neighbors, and boarded the shuttles that would take them to Captain Morrison's fleet. Dr. Lisa Grant was among the last humans to leave the Council's central research facility on the Planet Axis Prime. She had spent 15 years there, leading a team of xenobiologists from 7 different species in studying cross-species diseases. Her work had saved millions of lives across the galaxy. Now she was deleting her personal files from the system, making sure no private information remained behind. Her colleague, a Vrexian scientist named Thora, stood in the doorway of the laboratory watching her work. Thora finally spoke up. "I don't understand why you're leaving. Your research here is the most important work in the sector." Lisa paused in her work and turned to face her friend. "Some things matter more than career advancement. But what things? What could possibly be more important than the work we do here?" Lisa handed her security badge to Thora and picked up her single bag of personal belongings. "Dignity, self-respect, the knowledge that the people you work with see you as an equal." She walked to the door and stopped beside Thora. "I'll miss working with you. You're a brilliant scientist and a good friend." Thora watched Lisa walk away, still not understanding but feeling a deep sense of loss that she couldn't quite explain. In the council chambers, the 14 non-human species representatives gathered for an emergency session. Councillor Thex of the Vrexian Empire stood at his podium, his scales shifting through colors that indicated dismissive amusement. My fellow councillors were witnessing typical human emotional behavior. They're upset about the species hierarchy accord, so they're throwing what their own culture calls a tantrum. Give them a few months and they'll come back, probably with an apology. Councillor Yara of the Kelthian Combine nodded in agreement. Humans have always been overly emotional. Their departure is inconvenient, certainly, but hardly catastrophic. We managed perfectly well before they joined the council 200 years ago. We'll manage perfectly well after they leave. Other councillors murmured their agreement. A few expressed concern about the economic impact of losing human trading partners, but most seemed confident that the situation would resolve itself quickly. The session ended with a decision to take no action and wait for the humans to request readmission to the Council. Back on Captain Morrison's flagship, the last shuttle from New Vancouver docked with a gentle thump. Jake watched the passenger count tick upward on his display screen. 42,000 humans from New Vancouver were now safely aboard his fleet. He opened a channel to all ships. "Attention all vessels, this is Morrison. New Vancouver evacuation is complete. Set course for Brighton Colony. Jump in 30 minutes. The fleet began moving in perfect formation, hundreds of ships operating as one unified force. They had done this kind of coordination for decades while serving the Council's interests. Now they were using those same skills to leave Council space entirely. On Earth, President Rachel Foster addressed a packed assembly hall. "Our people are coming home," she said simply. "We will welcome them, find them housing, help them restart their lives. This is not an ending. This is a new beginning for humanity." The crowd applauded, but there was sadness in the sound. Everyone understood what this withdrawal meant. Humanity was turning its back on 2 centuries of galactic partnership, because that partnership had become something they could no longer accept. Ambassador. Helen Price's shuttle entered the jump gate that would take her out of Council space. She looked back at the Council headquarters one final time through the viewport. Part of her hoped they would realize their mistake and fix it. But a larger part of her knew that some lessons could only be learned through loss. The shuttle jumped, and the Council headquarters vanished from view. Helen turned her attention forward toward home, toward whatever future humanity would build for itself among the stars. 3 months had passed since the last human transport ship crossed the boundary into Sol system space. The Galactic Council had continued with business as usual, confident that the absence of one species would cause minimal disruption to their vast interstellar civilization. That confidence shattered on a cold morning when Defense Coordinator Voth received an urgent transmission from the Kelthian mining colonies along the Outer Rim. The message was brief and terrifying. Raiders from the Ravager clans had attacked 3 separate mining facilities in the span of 2 days, killing workers and stealing refined minerals worth billions of credits. Voth pulled up the security reports from the past 5 years and felt his blood run cold. Human peacekeeping forces had been responding to Ravager activity in that sector at least twice a month, sometimes more. The reports were filed in a secondary database that most Council members never bothered to check. Small conflicts, minor skirmishes, nothing worth discussing in the main chambers. Except now those small conflicts were growing into something much larger. Voth called an emergency meeting with the Council's military commanders. Admiral Kreth of the Vrexian fleet arrived first, his ceremonial armor polished to perfection. Commander Yola of the Kelthian Defense Force came next, followed by 3 other high-ranking officers. They gathered around the holographic display showing the Outer Rim sectors. Voth highlighted the affected areas. The Ravager clans have attacked 7 times in the past month. Before the human departure, we saw maybe 1 attack every 6 months in this region. Admiral Kreth studied the display with growing concern. Why didn't we know the humans were handling this many incidents? Because they never made a fuss about it, Voth replied quietly. They filed reports, logged every encounter, but they handled everything themselves. We just stopped paying attention. Commander Yola tapped the controls, bringing up deployment records. Look at this. Human ships were patrolling 30 sectors on a rotating basis. They maintained a presence in deep space regions where our forces refused to operate because the conditions are too harsh or the strategic value is too low. The meeting lasted 4 hours as the military officers came to terms with a disturbing reality. Humans had been quietly maintaining security across vast stretches of space that other Council species considered too dangerous, too remote, or too unprofitable to bother with. Now those regions were undefended and the predators were moving in. While the military struggled with security problems, the economic situation was deteriorating just as quickly. Administrator Kelvor, an Arxian who had replaced the human administrator Peter Chen, sat in his office surrounded by financial reports that made no sense. The numbers showed that 17 frontier colonies should have gone bankrupt years ago. Their operating costs exceeded their revenue by significant margins. Yet somehow they had remained solvent and even grown during that time. Kelvor dug deeper into the records and discovered something that shocked him. Human trading companies had been providing interest-free loans to these struggling colonies. When the colonies couldn't make payments, the humans deferred them. When natural disasters struck, the humans absorbed the losses and continued supply shipments anyway. It was financially irrational by every standard economic model, yet the humans had done it consistently for decades. He called his assistant, a young Kelthian named Vera, into his office. "Look at these records. The human company Stellar Trading lost money for 8 straight years supporting the colony on Deneb 4. Why would they do that?" Vera examined the files carefully. The notes say that Deneb 4 was struggling to establish its agricultural base after a fungal blight destroyed their first 3 harvests. Stellar Trading kept shipping supplies on credit until the colony recovered. "But they never recovered those losses," Kelvor said, pointing at the final accounting. "They just wrote it off." "Maybe they thought the relationship was more valuable than the immediate profit," Vera suggested. Kelvor leaned back in his chair. "That's not how economics works. That's not how any of this is supposed to work." The communication networks were experiencing problems too. Junior Officer Rack sat at the central relay station, watching error reports pile up faster than he could address them. Translation protocols were breaking down between species, causing minor diplomatic incidents almost daily. A Vrexian counselor had accidentally insulted a Kelthian delegation because the automated translator had missed a crucial context marker. 2 trade negotiations had collapsed due to misunderstandings that shouldn't have happened. Rax pulled up the maintenance logs and found entries made by Sarah Mitchell, the human communications officer who had worked at the station before the Exodus. She had logged into the system every single day, sometimes for hours at a time, making small adjustments to the translation matrices. Her notes explained that pure word-for-word translation wasn't enough. She had been accounting for cultural context, emotional undertones, and species-specific communication styles. Without those constant adjustments, the system was reverting to crude literal translations that caused more problems than they solved. He tried to replicate her work but quickly realized he lacked the deep understanding of multiple cultures that Sarah had developed over years of study and interaction. The job required more than technical skill. It required empathy and patience and a genuine desire to help different species understand each other. At the Medical Research Institute on Axis Prime, Dr. Thora stood in the laboratory that Lisa Grant had left behind 3 months earlier. She had been going through Lisa's published research, trying to continue the work on cross-species disease prevention. What she found disturbed her deeply. The official research budget provided by the Council covered perhaps 60% of the actual costs. Lisa had been funding the rest from personal accounts, never mentioning it to anyone, never asking for additional budget allocations. Thora pulled up the financial records with authorization from the Institute director. Over 15 years, Lisa had spent nearly 2 million credits of her own money on research equipment, lab supplies, and experimental treatments. She had done this while living in modest housing and driving an old transport vehicle. The research had saved countless lives across multiple species, and Lisa had paid for much of it herself. The director, an elderly Arxian named Velex, joined Thora in the laboratory. "I didn't know she was doing this." "None of us knew," Thora said softly. "She never told anyone. She just did the work because it needed doing." Velex looked around the empty laboratory. "We should have paid more attention. We should have appreciated what we had." The council called an emergency session 4 months after the human departure. Counselor Theck stood at his podium, his scales no longer showing dismissive amusement. The economic reports were undeniable. Council trade had contracted by 12%. Border security was failing. Medical research had stalled. Supply chains were breaking down. Counselor Yara spoke from her position. "Perhaps we should consider reaching out to the humans. Not to apologize, of course, but to discuss a possible return to partnership." "We will do no such thing," Counselor Thex replied firmly. "That would show weakness. We are the Galactic Council. We do not beg one species to return simply because their departure has caused temporary inconvenience." Other counselors murmured agreement, though several looked uncertain. Pride demanded that they find solutions without admitting they had made a mistake. The session ended with new task forces assigned to address the various crises, but no decision to contact humanity. In a small apartment on the council homeworld, Karen Foster sat at her desk preparing a report that would change everything. She was one of the few humans who had chosen to stay behind, unable to leave her partner who was too ill to travel. She worked as a junior analyst in the council archives, a position nobody paid much attention to. That obscurity had given her access to classified communications that revealed the truth behind the species hierarchy accord. Karen compiled everything she had found into a comprehensive document. She included internal memos, private communications between counselors, and strategic planning documents that showed the accord had been designed specifically to reduce human influence in council decisions. The humans had been voting against the three most powerful species too consistently, blocking initiatives that would have concentrated more power in fewer hands. She finished the report as the station's chronometer showed midnight. Tomorrow she would release it to every major news network in council space. The truth needed to come out regardless of the consequences for her own safety. Karen looked at a photo of Lisa Grant on her desk, remembering her friend's words, "Some things matter more than career advancement. Some things matter more than personal safety too." Karen pressed the send button and watched the report begin its journey across the galactic network. Within hours, everything would change. The report hit the galactic news networks like a shockwave. Within 6 hours of Karen Foster's release, every major media outlet across council space was running the story. The classified documents she had uncovered painted a damning picture of corruption and calculated discrimination that most citizens had never suspected existed in their government. Counselor Thex stood before the emergency assembly, his scales shifting through colors that indicated anger and defensiveness. Behind him, massive holographic displays showed excerpts from Karen's report, visible to every counselor and broadcast live to billions of viewers across the galaxy. He had demanded this public session, confident he could control the narrative and dismiss the accusations as human propaganda. "Members of the Council and citizens of our great alliance," Thex began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "we gather today to address baseless accusations made by a single disgruntled human analyst. The species hierarchy accord was passed through legitimate democratic process, with full debate and proper voting procedures. A junior counselor from the Arxian delegation, a young representative named Vex, stood up. Counselor Thex, the report includes internal communication showing that the accord was designed specifically to reduce human voting power. How do you explain these documents?" Thex's scales rippled with irritation. The accord was designed to recognize biological reality. Some species have evolved further than others. The telepathic species have capabilities that others lack. The energy-based life forms exist on a plane of existence beyond physical limitations. It's simply logical to recognize these differences in our governmental structure. And where did humans fall in this hierarchy? Vex pressed. Humans were classified in the middle tier, above the insectoid species but below the more advanced forms of life. It was a fair assessment based on objective criteria. Vex activated his personal display, projecting another document for all to see. "This internal memo from your office, dated 2 weeks before the accord was proposed, states that humans had voted against the three major power blocks in 73% of contested decisions over the previous 5 years. It specifically mentions that the accord would reduce their influence and make it easier to pass future initiatives." The chamber erupted in murmurs and shocked exclamations. Thex tried to speak, but Vex continued. "The memo also includes projections showing that humans would likely protest but ultimately accept their new status because they were too invested in council, infrastructure, and relationships to leave. That projection was wrong." Thex's scales had gone completely dark, a sign of extreme distress in Vrexian physiology. "You're taking these documents out of context. The accord served a legitimate purpose in organizing our government more efficiently." Another document appeared on the main display, this one sent by Counselor Yara to her senior staff. It read, "The humans are becoming problematic. They vote based on principles rather than practical politics. If we can reduce their representation, we can move forward with resource allocation plans that currently face human opposition." Counselor Yara stood quickly. That memo was a private communication discussing political strategy. Every government engages in such discussions. But you designed a system that classified entire species as lesser beings just to win votes, Vex said quietly. You created institutional discrimination because one species wouldn't go along with your plans. The broadcast channels were overwhelmed with public reaction. Citizens from every species were accessing Karen's full report, reading the documents for themselves and reaching their own conclusions. The carefully constructed justification for the species hierarchy accord was collapsing under the weight of evidence. Governor Lisa Carter had overseen the human evacuation from New Seattle, one of the most prosperous colonies in council space. Her final report to Earth had been brief and professional, but Karen's document dump had included a copy that Lisa had sent to the council administration. The report detailed everything the departing humans had left behind. A news anchor on the Kelthian Broadcasting Network read from Lisa's report on the evening news. Human colonists left behind fully functional infrastructure, including power generation facilities, water treatment plants, and transportation networks. They prepaid all utilities for 6 months to ensure no disruption of services. They left detailed operational manuals in 7 different languages. They even left their pets with neighbor species who had grown attached to them, providing medical records and care instructions. The anchor paused, his expression troubled. The report also notes that council security had been increased around human facilities during the evacuation, based on predictions that humans would sabotage systems or cause destruction out of spite. No such incidents occurred. Not a single one. Karen's document release included internal security assessments that had predicted human violence and retaliation. Military units had been placed on alert. Surveillance had been increased. Contingency plans had been drawn up to deal with expected acts of terrorism or infrastructure destruction. The humans had done none of those things. They had simply packed their belongings, said goodbye, and left everything functional for the species who remained behind. The contrast between expectations and reality was humiliating for council leadership. They had assumed the worst of humanity and been proven completely wrong. At the Central Military Command, Admiral Kreth stood before a holographic map showing the deteriorating security situation across council space. The Ravager clans had unified under a single warlord and were now launching coordinated attacks on multiple fronts. 3 border colonies had been evacuated in the past week alone. Defense Coordinator Voth joined him at the display. "We need to deploy the 4th and 7th fleets to the outer rim." "That will leave the core sectors underdefended," Kreth replied. "The core sectors aren't under attack. The frontier is burning." Kreth manipulated the display, pulling up deployment records from the human peacekeeping forces. "Look at how they did it. Small, fast response teams positioned at strategic points. They didn't need massive fleets. They needed presence and quick reaction times. Our doctrine doesn't work that way," Voth said. "We're trained for large-scale warfare between peer powers, not peacekeeping and anti-piracy operations. Then we need to change our doctrine. That will take years." "We don't have years." The conversation was interrupted by an alert signal. Another colony was under attack. Kreth sent the deployment orders, but both officers knew they were playing a losing game. The military machine of the Galactic Council was designed for the wrong kind of war. On the planet Nexus 4, a mixed colony of humans and Kelthians had operated a successful trading post for 30 years. When the humans had evacuated, they left behind a small recording for their Kelthian neighbors. The recording had been private, meant only for the people of that colony, but someone had uploaded it to the Galactic Network where it quickly went viral. The recording showed a human woman named Emma Harris standing in the empty community center. "To our Kelthian friends," she said, her voice warm despite the sadness in her eyes. "We've lived beside you for 3 decades. We've celebrated your festivals, mourned your losses, raised our children together. Leaving you is the hardest part of this whole situation. We want you to know that our departure isn't about you. It's about a government that decided some people matter less than others. We've seen that before in our own history. We know where it leads. We can't be part of it, but we won't forget you. The community center is paid for. The school has supplies for 2 years. The medical clinic has a full inventory. Take care of each other. Maybe someday things will be different and we can be neighbors again." The video ended with Emma turning off the lights and walking out the door. The simplicity and sincerity of the message struck a chord across the galaxy. This wasn't a dramatic political statement. It was just one person saying goodbye to friends, expressing hope for a better future. Counselor Thex tried to regain control of the narrative in a second public address. "We must not be swayed by emotional appeals and selective document releases. The species hierarchy accord was a rational response to real organizational challenges in our government." But his words rang hollow now. Too much evidence had been released. Too many citizens had read the documents and formed their own conclusions. Protests began on the council homeworld, small at first but growing larger each day. Citizens from all 14 non-human species joined together, demanding the repeal of the accord. In a university lecture hall on the Arxian homeworld, Professor Kalin taught a class on governmental ethics. She projected Karen Foster's report on the main screen and asked her students a simple question. If you need to lose someone to recognize their value, did you ever truly value them at all? The question spread across the galactic network, repeated in 1,000 different forums and discussion groups. It became the rallying cry for the protest movement. Young people especially embraced it, seeing the human departure as a moral failure of the older generation that they were determined not to repeat. 1 year had passed since the last human ship had departed from Council space. The economic reports that landed on Administrator Kelvor's desk told a story that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. The Council economy had contracted by 18%. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for decades were now plagued with delays and inefficiencies. Supply chains that humans had maintained were breaking down in ways that created cascading failures across multiple sectors. Kelvor presented his findings to the full Council assembly. The numbers were projected on screens that surrounded the chamber, impossible to ignore. "We are experiencing the worst economic decline in Council history," he said, his voice steady but grim. "Not because of war or natural disaster, but because we lost the species that was holding many of our systems together." Counselor Thex interrupted. "Surely you're not suggesting that one species was that critical to our economy." "I'm not suggesting it," Kelvor replied. "I'm showing it. Look at Sector 7. Human shipping companies handled 60% of the cargo transport there. They're gone now and no one has filled that gap. Colonies are running out of essential supplies. Look at Sector 12. Human financial institutions provided the credit that kept small businesses operating. Without that credit, we're seeing massive business failures." The council chamber fell silent as the representatives absorbed the data. It was one thing to notice problems. It was another to see the full scope of the disaster laid out in undeniable numbers. Admiral Kreth had replaced Admiral Kyle Bennett as commander of the Deep Space Defense Perimeter. Bennett had been a quiet man who filed regular reports that few bothered to read. Now Kreth understood why those reports had been so detailed. Bennett had been documenting everything because he knew someone would need that information eventually. Kreth sat in his office reviewing Bennett's final logs. The human admiral had maintained coordination with monitoring stations scattered across neutral zones, technically outside Council jurisdiction. These stations provided early warning of threats approaching Council space, tracking everything from asteroid swarms to hostile fleet movements. They were positioned in locations that required crews to endure harsh conditions for months at a time, far from any support or relief. When a large, unidentified fleet appeared on long-range sensors approaching from the galactic east, Kreth tried to access the monitoring stations for detailed information. His requests were met with automated messages. The stations had been powered down and evacuated. The humans had taken their watchfulness with them. "How many of these stations were there?" Kreth asked his intelligence officer. 47 confirmed, sir. Possibly more that weren't in our official records. And they're all shut down. Every single one. The humans sent shutdown teams to each station before the final evacuation. They didn't leave anything behind that could be used. Kreth felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "So we're blind." "In those sectors, yes, sir. We're blind." The agricultural crisis hit harder than anyone had anticipated. On the mixed colony of Harmony Ridge, crops were failing at an alarming rate. The colony administrator, a Kelthian named Vex, stood in the fields with the chief agricultural scientist trying to understand what was going wrong. "The soil chemistry is wrong," the scientist explained. "When humans and Kelthians first settled this world together, a human specialist named Mary Hughes developed hybrid farming techniques. She modified both Kelthian and human crops so they could grow in the same soil without competing for resources. We have her research files," Vex said. "Can't we just follow her methods?" "We tried, but the files only show what she did, not why she did it. Every growing season brought new challenges. Mary made adjustments based on weather patterns, soil conditions, pest problems. She shared her solutions freely with hundreds of colonies. Without her ongoing research, we're losing crops." Vex looked across the failing fields. Similar problems were being reported from 30 other mixed colonies. Mary Hughes had been one person, but her knowledge had supported food production for millions. The younger generation of council citizens were asking questions that their elders couldn't comfortably answer. At a university on the Vrexian homeworld, a student named Cora confronted her professor during a political science lecture. "You taught us that the council represents the best of galactic civilization," Cora said. "But we drove away an entire species just because they wouldn't vote the way the powerful wanted. How is that the best of anything?" The professor, an older Vrexian named Theron, struggled to respond. "The situation was more complex than it appears, was it? I've read the documents. I've seen the evidence. The council created a law that said some people matter less than others, and when humans refused to accept that, they left peacefully. They didn't attack us. They didn't sabotage anything. They just left, and now we're suffering because we took them for granted." Similar conversations were happening across council space. Young people who had grown up with human friends and neighbors were confronting their parents and teachers about what had happened. The comfortable justifications that the older generation offered were no longer accepted without question. Engineer Frank Miller had worked in the orbital construction yards above the council homeworld for 20 years. His final log entry had been recorded on the day he left, and someone had posted it to the public networks where it spread rapidly. Frank's weathered face appeared on billions of screens across the galaxy. "This is my last day at the yards," Frank said in the recording. "I've spent 2 decades here building ships, maintaining stations, training the next generation of engineers. My apprentice Vola is a brilliant Arxian engineer who's going to do great things. I've left her all my personal notes and techniques. I hope she'll carry on the work we started together." Frank paused and looked directly at the camera. "I want to be clear about something. I'm not leaving because I hate anyone here. I'm leaving because my government passed a law that says I'm worth less than some people and worth more than others, just because of how I was born. I can't live under that kind of system. It goes against everything my species learned from our own painful history." He smiled sadly. "I'll miss this place. I'll miss the people I worked with. It's been an honor serving beside you all. Take care of each other." The recording ended, but the impact continued. Frank's simple dignity and clear explanation resonated with people who were trying to understand what had happened. This wasn't politics or propaganda. It was just one person explaining why they couldn't stay. The council leadership finally authorized opening communications with Earth. A carefully worded message was drafted by a committee of senior diplomats. The message acknowledged that perhaps the species hierarchy accord had been implemented too hastily. It suggested that adjustments could be made to address human concerns. It extended an invitation for humanity to return to council membership under revised terms. The message was sent through official channels to Earth's government. 3 days later, a response arrived. Ambassador Chris Morgan, who had replaced Helen Price as Earth's primary diplomatic representative, had crafted the reply personally. The message was brief and professionally courteous. "The Galactic Council's communication has been received and reviewed. Humanity appreciates the Council's willingness to reconsider certain policies. However, after careful consideration, we have decided that returning to Council membership would not be in humanity's best interests at this time. We wish the Council well in its future endeavors and will continue to honor all existing treaties and maintain cordial diplomatic relations with individual member species. We hold no animosity toward the people of the Council, but we cannot rejoin an institution that needed to lose us before recognizing our value." The response was made public simultaneously on both Earth and Council networks. There would be no private negotiations, no behind-the-scenes deals. Humanity had made its decision and stated it clearly for everyone to see. Counselor Yara read the message 3 times, unable to believe what she was seeing. "They're refusing to return? Even with concessions? They don't trust us anymore," Vex said quietly. The young Arxian counselor had become increasingly vocal in council sessions. "Why would they? We changed the rules only after suffering consequences. That's not principle. That's pragmatism. They know the difference." In the council archives, Karen Foster continued her work despite the investigation into her document leak. Council security had questioned her extensively, but hadn't yet decided whether to charge her with any crimes. Public opinion had swung strongly in her favor, making prosecution politically difficult. She received a private message on her personal terminal one evening. It was from Lisa Grant, her friend who had evacuated months earlier. The message was simple. Thank you for your courage. You did the right thing. I hope you can join us someday. Karen looked at the message for a long time. Her partner's health had improved enough that travel might be possible soon. Maybe it was time to go home. She had done what she could here. The council would have to figure out the rest on its own. The protests continued to grow. What had started as small demonstrations had become a movement that crossed species boundaries. 2 years had passed since humanity's quiet departure from council space. The Galactic Council chambers looked different now, with empty seats where human representatives had once sat, and new faces among the counselors who remained. The old guard was losing power as younger representatives pushed for reforms. But change came slowly to an institution that had existed for thousands of years. The crisis that everyone had feared finally arrived on a cold morning when Defense Coordinator Voth received simultaneous distress calls from 7 Outer Rim colonies. The Ravager clans had spent 2 years consolidating power under a single warlord named Krax, and now they were launching their largest offensive in recorded history. 50 warships hit the colonies in coordinated strikes, overwhelming local defenses and causing massive casualties. Admiral Kreth stood in the command center watching the tactical displays with growing horror. Council forces were moving to intercept, but they were too slow, too far away, trained for the wrong kind of combat. The Ravagers used hit-and-run tactics, striking hard and retreating before the heavy Council warships could engage. 3 colonies were completely overrun in the first day of fighting. Counselor Yara stood beside Admiral Kreth, her face pale. How long until our fleets arrive? 48 hours for the nearest units, Kreth replied. But by then the Ravagers will have stripped those colonies and moved on to new targets. What would the humans have done? Kreth pulled up old tactical records from human peacekeeping operations. They would have had response teams already in position. Small, fast ships that could intercept within hours instead of days. They would have prevented this from ever growing this large. The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. The humans would have handled this crisis in a matter of weeks. The Council was looking at months of brutal warfare with an uncertain outcome. The younger generation of Council representatives called an emergency session without waiting for approval from senior leadership. Vex of the Arxian delegation stood at the podium, his voice carrying across the packed chamber and broadcast to billions of viewers. We need to stop pretending that everything is fine, Vex said. Our economy has collapsed. Our borders are burning. Our citizens are suffering. And we did this to ourselves because we were too proud to treat one species as equals. Counselor Thex tried to interrupt, but Vex continued speaking. The humans didn't destroy us when they left. They didn't need to. We destroyed ourselves through our own arrogance and discrimination. Every problem we face now is a direct result of taking them for granted and driving them away. A Kelthian representative stood up. What do you propose we do? Beg them to come back? I propose we learn from our mistakes, Vex replied. I propose we dismantle the species hierarchy accord completely. I propose we reform our government to ensure this can never happen again. And yes, I propose we approach humanity not with demands or expectations, but with genuine apology and hope for forgiveness. The chamber erupted in heated debate. The older counselors argued that such actions would show weakness and damage the council's authority. The younger representatives argued that authority built on discrimination deserved to be damaged. Ambassador Chris Morgan sat in his office on Earth reading the reports from council space with careful attention. He had been humanity's diplomatic voice for 2 years, managing the delicate balance of maintaining cordial relations while keeping firm boundaries. His terminal chimed with an incoming message request marked urgent priority. The message was from Vex personally, not through official council channels. Morgan opened it and read carefully. Vex was requesting a private meeting, not as a council representative but as an individual who wanted to understand what humanity had lost and what the council needed to learn. Morgan composed his response slowly. I'm willing to meet with you, but not as a negotiation for humanity's return. If you're seeking understanding, I can offer that. Come to Earth, see how we've rebuilt, talk to the people who left. Maybe then you'll truly comprehend what your government threw away. 3 weeks later, Vex arrived on Earth with a small delegation of young council representatives. No senior leadership, no official diplomatic mission, just a group of people seeking to understand. They were taken to New Seattle, which had been rebuilt on Earth after the colony bearing that name was abandoned in Council space. Governor Lisa Carter met them at the spaceport. She had aged visibly in 2 years, the weight of relocating thousands of colonists showing in the lines on her face. But she greeted the delegation warmly and offered to show them around the new city. They walked through streets that bustled with activity. Former colonists from a dozen worlds now lived side by side, building a new community together. Vex noticed something immediately that struck him as odd. "Your cities are much more densely populated than I expected," he said. "I thought Earth would feel empty after evacuating 5 million people from various colonies." Lisa smiled sadly. "We didn't just bring back our people from Council space. We brought home every human from any colony or station anywhere in the galaxy, almost 8 million people total. We decided that if we were leaving, we would do it completely. No scattered populations that could be used as leverage or hostages." The delegation visited a school where children from multiple former colonies studied together. A young teacher named Rachel Adams spoke with them about the challenges of integrating students who had lived vastly different lives. These children left behind friends, homes, everything familiar, Rachel explained. Many of them are angry about it. They don't understand why adults made the choices that uprooted their lives, but we're teaching them about dignity and principles. We're showing them that sometimes the hardest choice is the right choice. One of the Kelthian delegates asked a question. "Do they hate us?" Rachel considered carefully before answering. "They don't hate you. They're sad. They miss their friends, but hate? No. We're teaching them that what happened wasn't about individual people. It was about a system that needed to change. You can't hate people for being part of a flawed system, especially when they didn't create it." That evening, the delegation met with Ambassador Morgan in a conference room overlooking the new city. Morgan had invited several other humans to join the conversation, including Captain Jake Morrison, who had commanded the evacuation fleet, Dr. Lisa Grant, who had left her research position, and Engineer Frank Miller, whose final message had touched so many people. Beck spoke first. "We've spent the day seeing what you've built here, talking to people who left everything behind. I need to ask you directly, is there any possibility that humanity would consider returning to the Council?" The room fell silent. Morgan looked at his companions before responding. "That's the wrong question," Morrison said quietly. "You should be asking whether the Council has truly changed or if you've just learned to be more careful about discrimination." "We're dismantling the species hierarchy accord," Vex replied. "We're implementing reforms to ensure equal representation." "Because you suffered for treating us badly," Lisa Grant added. "Not because you realized it was wrong. There's a difference that matters." Frank Miller leaned forward. "I've been thinking about this a lot. What would it take for us to trust the Council again? And honestly, I don't think it can happen with this generation of leadership. They learned the wrong lesson. They learned that discrimination has practical costs. They didn't learn that it's morally wrong regardless of costs." Vex felt the weight of those words. "What about the next generation? What if we change everything? What if we spend decades proving that we've learned the real lesson?" Morgan finally spoke. "Maybe then. Maybe when there are council leaders who never knew the old system. Maybe when there are citizens who grew up learning this history and understanding why it must never be repeated. But that's for your children to decide, not us. We're done trying to fix your government. We're focused on building our own future now." The delegation returned to council space with a report that spread across every network. They described a humanity that wasn't angry or vengeful but was fundamentally done with the Galactic Council. The humans had moved on. They were building something new, and they weren't looking back. The Council voted to formally repeal the Species Hierarchy Accord 6 months later. Reforms were implemented to guarantee equal representation for all species. New leadership slowly replaced the old guard, but the damage to the Council's unity and moral authority remained. 3 years after humanity's departure, Engineer Kate Phillips's sealed message activated automatically. She had left it behind, programmed to open after a specific time delay. The message appeared on terminals across Council space, containing detailed technical manuals for every system humans had built or improved over 2 centuries. Kate's face appeared on the recording, speaking directly to the camera. "If you're seeing this, then 3 years have passed and we haven't returned. These files contain everything you need to maintain the infrastructure we left behind. We built these things not because we wanted recognition or payment. We built them because they needed building. We're leaving these instructions with you not as a weapon or bargaining chip, but as a gift. What you do with them and how you treat each other going forward will define